Most discussions of wartime food production focus on state campaigns: Britain's Dig for Victory, American Victory Gardens, German Ration Administration, Soviet collective output. The assumption is that governments organized survival and civilians followed instructions, but what tends to be overlooked is how frequently those systems failed at the margins. Transport bottlenecks, fuel shortages, requisitions, occupation policies, and, simple bureaucratic miscalculation left gaps that official ration books could not fill. In those gaps, families improvised. They did not simply grow vegetables in approved plots. They cultivated food in places unlikely to be noticed, confiscated or destroyed. Courtyards, forest edges, drainage ditches, cellars and bombed-out structures became productive spaces. These efforts rarely appeared in propaganda photographs, yet they formed a quiet layer of resilience beneath the formal wartime economy. Understanding these hidden food sources tells us something important about how societies actually endure prolonged crisis, not in theory, but under pressure. Jerusalem artichokes quietly replaced vulnerable staple crops in marginal soil. The Jerusalem artichoke, often called the sunchoke, became an understated wartime ally across parts of Germany, Eastern Europe, and occupied territories. Unlike potatoes, which were tightly rationed and highly visible in official agriculture, sunchokes could be planted along fence lines, behind sheds, or in narrow strips of poor soil. They tolerated neglect, survived frost, and honestly remained in the ground until needed. This really mattered in regions where occupying authorities requisitioned visible harvests. In Poland and Ukraine, German occupation policy diverted large portions of grain and potatoes to the Reich, which left local populations with pretty limited reserves. A crop that could remain hidden underground and be harvested gradually, well, it offered a real strategic advantage. Because sunchokes resemble ornamental sunflowers above ground, they attracted less scrutiny than conventional food crops. Post-war agricultural analysis in parts of Germany noted that households with diversified tuber crops actually endured caloric shortages more effectively than those reliant on a single staple. The lesson here is not merely botanical. It really underscores the vulnerability of centralized food systems that depend on just a few high-visibility crops. In survival planning, resilience often lies in biological diversity and honestly low-profile cultivation. Mushrooms flourished in cellars, tunnels, and other spaces untouched by sunlight. Urban warfare and strategic bombing reshaped European cities into fragmented landscapes. While destruction brought hardship, it also created hidden interior spaces, basements, abandoned warehouses, transit tunnels, largely shielded from oversight. In Britain, France, Germany, and Poland, families and small cooperatives used these spaces to cultivate mushrooms. Mushrooms require composted organic material rather than open farmland. In cities facing fuel shortages and fertilizer scarcity, organic waste was often abundant. Cellars provided stable temperatures and concealment. In occupied Warsaw, underground networks reportedly used basement cultivation to supplement rations that had been sharply reduced under German policy. This adaptation had long-term implications. After the war, controlled environment agriculture gained renewed attention, particularly in densely populated or industrialized regions. The wartime experience demonstrated that food production did not depend solely on sunlight and open fields. It could actually be relocated into protected interior environments. Modern urban farming and vertical agriculture trace part of their practical lineage to these improvised efforts. Rabbits became a discreet and efficient source of protein in confined urban spaces. Large livestock required pasture, feed, and visibility, three liabilities in wartime cities. Rabbits, by contrast, required little space and reproduced rapidly. In France, Belgium, and even in parts of Britain, rabbit hutches appeared in backyards, sheds, and basements. In some bomb-damaged neighborhoods, partially collapsed structures concealed small breeding operations. Under occupation, livestock was frequently subject to inspection and requisition. Rabbits, being small and quiet, were easier to conceal. They consumed kitchen scraps and limited forage, converting otherwise wasted calories into protein. This was especially significant where meat rations had fallen to minimal levels. Urban rabbit keeping was sometimes discouraged by authorities concerned about sanitation or unauthorized slaughter, yet enforcement proved inconsistent. Families who maintained even a small breeding pair possessed a renewable protein source largely independent of official supply chains. After the war, civil defense manuals in several European countries referenced small livestock husbandry as part of emergency planning. The reasoning was clear, compact, high reproduction animals offered flexibility when centralized meat production faltered. The wartime rabbit was less a symbol of thrift and more a case study in adaptive protein management. Hedgerows and forest margins were, deliberately managed for berries, nuts, and edible greens. Rural communities in France, the Balkans, Germany, and parts of the Soviet Union relied heavily on hedgerows and forest edges, spaces often ignored by formal agriculture. These boundary zones provided blackberries, raspberries, hazelnuts, chestnuts, and edible greens. During the war, families did more than gather, they managed. Pruning encouraged berry growth. Selective protection of nut trees ensured seasonal harvests. In Germany, organized drives collected acorns and chestnuts, some processed into flour extenders. While some of these efforts were state-directed, much of the practical knowledge, remained local and informal. These marginal zones, they offered concealment. They were less likely to be systematically inspected or requisitioned than open fields. In partisan regions of Eastern Europe, forest edge food sources supported both civilians and resistance groups operating beyond formal supply lines. The broader lesson really concerns landscape awareness. Conventional agriculture, often prioritizes large open fields optimized for mechanization. Wartime scarcity, interestingly enough, revived older ecological knowledge and understanding that boundary spaces can actually sustain meaningful caloric production. Modern resilience planning, increasingly revisits this principle through agroforestry and permaculture models that integrate food into transitional land. Sugar beets and home-processed syrups, they really compensated for the collapse of refined sugar supply. Sugar shortages were widespread during the war, especially in occupied Europe, where production and distribution were honestly tightly controlled. Industrial sugar refineries depended on transport networks and centralized processing, which made them, quite vulnerable to bombing and fuel shortages. As refined sugar disappeared from civilian markets, families, they sought out alternatives. In parts of Poland, France, and the Low Countries, small strips of sugar beets were planted along garden edges or interspersed with other crops. Unlike large monoculture beet fields intended for industrial processing, these were, discrete plantings for home use. Boiling down beets into crude syrup required labor and fuel, both of which were pretty scarce commodities, but honestly, the caloric payoff justified the effort. Sweeteners provided more than just taste. They delivered concentrated energy and, perhaps even more importantly, preserved morale during prolonged deprivation. The need to relearn small-scale processing techniques, well, it really revealed just how dependent pre-war societies had become on industrial refinement. When refineries were damaged or, commandeered, localized knowledge re-emerged. After 1945, agricultural planners across Europe debated food system decentralization. While, large-scale industry eventually reasserted its dominance, the wartime experience really did influence policy discussions about regional self-sufficiency and emergency reserves. The improvised beet syrup of occupied households, well, it actually reflected a structural vulnerability in modern food chains. These hidden food sources honestly reveal more about endurance than official campaigns ever could. State-sponsored programs such as Victory Gardens were important morale tools and contributed meaningful production. But beneath those visible efforts lay a quieter network of adaptation shaped by necessity rather than propaganda. Families selected crops that could survive neglect, concealment, and irregular harvesting. They exploited overlooked spaces, cellars, hedgerows, marginal soil, because, well, those spaces were less likely to attract confiscation or destruction. The Second World War exposed the fragility of centralized logistics. Rail lines were bombed, fuel was diverted, occupation authorities prioritized military supply over civilian welfare. In that environment, resilience emerged not solely from industrial capacity, but from local knowledge and biological diversity. For modern preparedness discussions, the historical record offers, well, a caution: stockpiles are finite. Central systems, however powerful, can fracture under stress. Adaptability, understanding how to produce food in unconventional spaces, how to diversify crops and protein sources, how to work within ecological limits, proved decisive for many households. Remembering these lesser-known practices deepens our understanding of the war as more than a sequence of battles and treaties. It reminds us that endurance was negotiated daily in courtyards, cellars, and along hedgerows. The quiet cultivation of hidden food sources formed an unrecorded infrastructure of survival. If you value careful, grounded historical analysis that looks beyond the obvious narratives, consider subscribing to The Prepper Historian and sharing this video. These overlooked stories of adaptation deserve sustained attention, not as nostalgia, but as lessons in how societies withstand prolonged strain.